Hey everyone, in this video we are going to cover the acid-base balance and how to interpret those results.
Welcome to CASRN, where I teach you about all things nursing.
In this video we're going to cover the lab values, the compensation techniques, and the interpretation tricks on how to know where you fall inside all of that based on those lab values. All right, quick review on the labs. We are going to talk about pH, PaCO2, and HCO3. pH is partial pressure of hydrogen ions. This is just the overall acid-base balance. And the normal ranges for this are 7.35 to 7.45. On PaCO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, this is an acid and it will lower the pH. This is a reflection of how the lungs are doing, and the normal levels are between 35 and 45. Then the HCO3 is bicarbonate and it's a base, which will increase the pH. And this is a reflection of how the kidneys are doing, and the normal level is 22 to 26. As a side note, if you're using HESI, the HESI lists the levels as 21 to 28, so just be aware of that. Now the lungs, if these are off, this is going to cause respiratory acidosis or alkalosis. So this is easy to remember because the CO2 is exhaled from the lungs. So that's pretty easy. And then if you can just remember the HCO3 is in the kidneys, which is metabolic because that's part of the metabolic system. And then just a quick side note here is that a pH that is less than 6.8 or greater than 7.8 is considered incompatible with life. If your pH falls outside of that, your body simply cannot function. So quick review of what these labs mean. So the PaO2, that's that partial pressure of oxygen, and this actually determines how the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin. There's a lot of physiology here, but ideally 80 to 100 milligrams over mercury is ideal for how that will bind. Then we've got our SaO2, which is for respiratory function. So this is not acid-base balance. This is the percentage of hemoglobin that is saturated with oxygen. So this is used to evaluate respiratory function. So this is very different. It's not a pressure related thing. This is a percentage related thing. And the normal percentage of this is going to be 95 to 100%. So this is if you put one of those little pulse ox on your finger and it gives you your pulse and it gives you your oxygen. That's what you're measuring in this case. The partial pressure of oxygen is actually something that has to be measured through an art line. That's an arterial line that goes in typically through your wrist. Now, compensation, the body has lots of compensation mechanisms where it will do its best to overcome what's going and self-regulate. It likes to be in that stage of homeostasis. So inside metabolic and respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, you're going to have compensation mechanisms. So it's important to understand that one body system will try to compensate for the other. The kidneys will secrete extra HCO3 or hydrogen depending on the pH, and if the body is acidotic, then it will secrete that and reabsorb it so that it can help maintain the correct pH level. If it's alkalotic, then it's going to do the opposite and it's going to secrete that HCO3 and reabsorb the hydrogen. And the kidneys can take up to 24 hours to respond to a pH change. It takes the longest, but it is the most effective. And then we've got the lungs, who are going to act a little bit more quickly, but they're not going to be quite as effective in resolving the problem. So the lungs are going to attempt to remove or keep CO2 depending on what the pH is there. So if you're acidotic, then the respiratory rate is going to increase to exhale and get rid of that extra CO2. And if you're alkalotic, then it's going to do the opposite and the respiratory rate is going to decrease because it wants to hold on to that CO2 in order to bring that pH back to where it needs to be. So kidneys will then respond to a respiratory problem. If there's something going on with the lungs and the oxygen exchange there and something's not working properly, then the kidneys are going to do something and kick in. And then the lungs are going to respond to compensate for the kidneys and the metabolic issues. So when we start looking at these different pH and if it's respiratory or alkalotic, we're also going to look a little bit more into that and say, hey, is the other system compensating and has it done so successfully? So we've got a few different types of compensation. So we've got uncompensated, and this means that the pH is going to be abnormal and that either the respiratory system or the metabolic system is also abnormal. And then the one that would normally compensate is normal, within normal ranges. So it's not doing anything. Then we have partial compensation, and this is where the pH is still abnormal, but both PaCO2 and HCO3 are abnormal, usually on the opposite end. So one will be acidotic and one will be alkalotic, in that it's trying to compensate and bring both back down to the middle, trying to bring that pH back down into the middle normal range. And then we've got the fully compensated, and this is where the pH is actually going to be normal, but again, both of the PaCO2 and the HCO3 are going to be abnormal because they've compensated, system has compensated for the other in order to make the pH normal, but they themselves are outside of the normal ranges because one is trying to compensate for the other. So let's kind of jump into this. I think the best way to do this is really just practice. I don't think that there's any other way to make this any easier. So let's jump into the practicing section of this. All right, I'm going to take you through a couple different methods for interpreting results. The first, we've got both the ROME method and the Tic-Tac-Toe method. So remember this as we're going through these, is that what is our goal here? We need to figure out if it's the respiratory system or the metabolic system that's having a problem. So is it the lungs or the kidneys? And then we need to know if it's acidosis or if it's alkalosis. And then we also need to know if the other body system is compensating for that problem. All right, so first off, what you want to do is come in and create this table. So I've created this table already, and you can see here, like, we've got our pH. This is just the whole body system, what's going on here. Then we've got our lungs, and we've got our kidneys. And these are our normal ranges. I like to make things as simple as possible, especially when I'm taking a test, especially when it comes to taking something like a big exit test for ATI or for HESI, and then getting into the NCLEX. Like, you've got so many questions, you just need to be able to reserve your brain power as much as possible. So in doing that, I just write down my levels right here in this tic-tac-toe method. So you can see, this looks like a little tic-tac-toe grid. I'm going to write down my normal because then I don't have to think about it, and it's really easy, and I only have to do this once. And this stuff is ingrained in my brain. 7.35 to 7.45 is normal. And then right here, now the lungs, remember how at the very beginning right here we were talking about how this is an acid. Okay, so what this means is that these are actually flipped. So you would not write this 35 to 45. We don't want to do that, okay? Because more of it equals an acid, and less of it is going to equal a base, okay? Or it's going to make it more alkaline. So this number right here has to be flipped. And then we come down here and we've got our 22 to 26. And again, this one is a base. So you're going to see that more of this is going to make things more base, and less of it is going to make it more acidotic. So here's our little question down here that we're going to do. So we've got a couple numbers that we need to pull out. We've got our pH, we've got our CO2, and we've got our CO3 right here. So let's plug these numbers in based on where they should go. So my pH is 7.31, which means that it's less than this number right here, right? It falls outside the range, and it's going to fall into the acid. So we're going to write 7.31 right there. Then we go over to the CO2, and it is 67. So we're looking at this again, and we're saying, because this one is flipped, so respiratory is opposite, and we're going to learn that in another technique here in just a second. This is 67. So it also falls into the acid. And then we've got our HCO3, which is 29. So we come down here and we look, and it's above 26. So we're going to write it down here in 29. All right, so if we look at this, we've got two that are in the same. So our pH is going to tell us if it's acidotic or alkalotic. So we've got acidosis right here. So we've got acidosis, and then the next one that matches up is the lungs, or the PaCO2. So that's respiratory. So the answer here on what this is going to be respiratory acidosis. Now we've got one more thing that we need to look at for. So we found that it's respiratory acidosis. It's the respiratory system that's acting incorrectly. However, now we need to know, is this compensated or not compensated or partially compensated? So remember that when we looked at the compensation, this acidosis, this pH level right here is in the acidosis range, which means that this has to be a partial or none. Because it's outside of the normal ranges. If it was inside normal ranges, then it would be a full compensation, but it's not. So then we need to know, is it compensated or not compensated? So we need to come and look down at the opposite body system. So we've got this metabolic down here with the kidneys, and see how it's on the opposite side right here? It's at 29, which means that it is trying to compensate. So this is a partial compensation. Now let's try another question. All right, so looking at this really quick, I want you to try, you can pause the video right here and see if you want, but same concept. You're going to go ahead and put in your table. So I've got my table here, and then we're going to plug in our numbers. So our pH is 7.6. So that's actually over here into the base. And then our PaCO2 is 32. And then our HCO3 is 25. So that's actually in the normal range. So it's going to go down here in the middle. So we can look at this again in our two that match. So we've got alkalosis and respiratory. So this one is going to be respiratory alkalosis. So then we hop over here and we're like, is it compensated or not compensated? So because the pH itself is outside of the normal range, this is going to be either none or partial. And the only way that it would be partial is if the body system opposite of this one was over here. So in this case, there actually is no compensation going on because this is inside its normal range. So the kidneys have not yet tried to compensate for what the respiratory system is doing. All right, let's try one more. Go ahead and pause if you'd like and make your own table. I will just go ahead and continue. So again, here's my new table. We've got our measurement of arterial gases, which is showing a pH of 7.1. So that's going to bring it over here. We've got our PaCO2 of 22, so that's going to be over here, and our HCO3 of 12. So our two that match are pH and our HCO3. So this is actually going to be metabolic acidosis. And then is it compensated or not compensated? So again, remember, if it's fully compensated, the pH would need to be right here, which it's not. So this is going to either be none or partial. Now, the way that we know that is a partial is because the opposite body system from where this lands right here is trying to compensate, and it's completely on the other end of the spectrum at a 22. So we know that this is a partial compensation in that the lungs are trying to compensate, but they have not been able to bring this pH back over into the normal range. All right, now our next method is going to be the ROME method, which is called respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. So what it's saying here is that when it comes to the PaCO2 and those numbers, and with flipping them, instead of actually writing them down backwards, you're just going to remember in your head that it's listed in a 45 to a 35 option. That the higher the number is acid and the lower the number is a base, versus the opposite with pH and with HCO3, that the lower the number with both of those is acid and the higher the number with both of those is a base. So this is just another way of explaining that same thing, that acidosis, respiratory is opposite. So this means that you've got a decreased CO2, and then with the metabolic is equal, that's going to mean a high HCO3. And then with alkalosis, you're going to have an increased CO2 and a low HCO3. So I made a table on this next page here. We've got the same concept here that we're going to look at, but we've got this table to kind of help you understand this first one that we're going to go through. So an easy way to do this is to just come down and we're going to write out ROME. Okay, so this is going to be our respiratory, and this is going to be our metabolic, and then we got to have our pH. Okay, so in this case right here, here's our numbers, 7.31, 67, and 29. So we're going to come back over here again. We're going to do the exact same thing. So our pH is 7.31, which is low, which means if you think back on that of whether it's going to be acidotic or alkalotic. So in this case, it's going to be acidotic. Okay, so we've got a low pH, which is acid. And then we've come over here to our respiratory. So our respiratory is 67. This is 67, which means that it is really high. And that means that it's also an acid. Okay, because it's opposite. So remember that. I know that that's really confusing. So then we've got the metabolic, which is going to be 29. And that's also going to be high. Okay, so if we just want, and that's going to be base or alkalotic. Okay, so then the two that match right here, acid and acid. So what we want to look at here is that this is going to be respiratory acidosis. Okay, so then we also want to check and see if it's compensated or not compensated. So 29, that's outside of the normal range, right? Because our normal one is 26. So this is partial compensation because the pH is still outside of range of where it should be, but the base itself is trying to compensate. All right, let's go ahead and try this again. So we've got the same thing. Now I've got this table out of the way. So we want to do the same thing here. We're just going to go ahead and write down ROME. And then we also want to make sure we're going to get our pH. Okay, so our pH is 7.6. Oh. Okay, and so does that make it acidotic or alkalotic? Our normal ranges are 7.35 to 7.45. So this is actually going to make it alkalotic or base, okay, or alkalosis. So now we need to figure out which body system it is that's also doing that. Okay, so we've got our respiratory right here. We've got our metabolic right here. So our next one is 32. Okay, so then we want to look and see with this, it's because it's respiratory and it's 32. Our normal range is 35 to 45. It's going to be the opposite, right? So we're going to do this, and it's also going to be alkalotic. Then we come over here to our metabolic, which is 25. And our normal range here that's within range. So this is going to be normal. So basically what we're stuck with here is respiratory alkalosis. Okay, so with that respiratory alkalosis, then we need to know if it's compensated or not compensated. And in this case, we have no compensation because this is normal, which means that the kidneys are not yet compensating for the respiratory system. All right, now we've got one more here. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to lay out our ROME. We're going to do our pH. Okay, our pH is 7.1. That is going to be on the low side, which means that it's acid. Now we're going to go through here and we're going to find our respiratory, which is 22. And 22 is going to be on the low side as well, but that's going to be opposite, right? So we're going to point up for that, and this is going to be an alkalotic. Okay, so then our next one is metabolic, which is 12, which is also very low, and that's going to be acidic. Okay, so we can see that our two that match, acid and acid, right here. So this one is going to be metabolic acidosis. And then our next question then is whether or not it's compensated, and we can tell that it's compensated because this one is alkalotic. So this is going to be a partial compensation because the pH is still outside of normal ranges. All right, quick review of everything that we covered. The normal pH range is 7.35 to 7.45. The normal PaCO2 is 35 to 45, and our normal HCO3 is 22 to 26. Make sure that you understand compensation. Basically, it's when one body system compensates for the other. and tries to bring that pH level back inside of the normal range. And then we've got our two different techniques of tic-tac-toe and ROME for interpreting those results. Go ahead and watch this a couple times and review it and practice along with me. And then please comment below and let me know what you think. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in. Please help me grow my channel by clicking subscribe and follow below.